Hello, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine, Content Specialist for the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship, which is part of the School of Politics, Security, and International Affairs at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. Welcome to our Middle School Civics Highlights series. Today we focus on benchmark CG.3.1. Analyze the advantages of the United States Constitutional Republic over other forms of government in safeguarding liberty, freedom, and a representative government. In Part 3, we focus on U.S. principles being distinguished from the U.S. from authoritarian and totalitarian nations. We focus on benchmark clarification 4. Students will explain how the application of checks and balances, consent of the governed, democracy, due process of law, federalism, individual rights, limited government, representative government, republicanism, rule of law, and separation of powers distinguishes the United States Constitutional Republic from authoritarian and totalitarian nations. In summary, we will ask the question, how does the application of U.S. principles demonstrate the U.S. Constitutional Republic from authoritarian and totalitarian nations? We now focus our attention on distinguishing checks and balances, consent of the governed, and democracy in the U.S. by comparing these principles to authoritarian and totalitarian nations. Let's first look at the principle of checks and balances. The United States, being a constitutional republic, includes checks and balances. These checks and balances are built into the government. The way that we envision checks and balances is that even if the legislature is elected by the people, the legislature cannot make decisions by itself most of the time. This means that legislative decisions, such as laws, for example, may be checked by other institutions and powers of government. So, for example, within the United States Congress, to pass a law, both the Senate and the House must agree on the same version of a bill before that bill goes to the president, who is the leader of the executive branch. And the leader of the executive branch has the power to say yes or no to a bill that has been proposed and presented to the president. Comparing this to North Korea, which is a totalitarian regime, the supreme leader in North Korea possesses full authority over the country. There are no checks and balances. And what about authoritarian regimes? Russia's constitution gives more power to the president, who can introduce legislation if the Duma, which is the legislature, refuses. The Russian president also controls the budget. This means that the Russian president decides how much money comes into the government, how much money goes out of the government, where the money comes from, and where the money goes. Let's now take a look at consent of the governed. With consent of the governed, representatives are elected in free and fair elections. Laws reflect the will of the people. So we very frequently have competitive elections in the United States, meaning that people are freely eligible to compete against individuals who hold power in government, such as in the next election running against them and explaining to the voters why they might be a better choice than their competitor. North Korea holds elections, as does Russia, but elections are neither free nor fair in either North Korea or Russia. What this means is that even though that there are elections, there may be one person's name on the ballot, because if somebody else might have openly criticized the leader of the government, whether it be North Korea in a totalitarian regime or Russia in an authoritarian regime, the leader might decide to arrest them, to punish them, to deny them due process as a way of keeping them from actually running. And as a consequence, people might also be concerned or fearful to vote for a competitor against the leader of a totalitarian or authoritarian regime. So this means that even though elections might be taking place, they are neither free nor fair. Now let's look at the principle of democracy. In a democracy, this means that the people rule. In the United States, we have a form of democracy called representative democracy. The people decide who will represent them, and thus the people can also have an opinion and engage with government and participate in elections to express their pleasure or displeasure with the decisions that government has made. In North Korea, as a totalitarian regime, the Constitution lists the country as a socialist state, and the supreme leader is often referred to as a dictator. And yet, because the supreme leader is referred to as a dictator, this excludes rule by the people. Similarly, Russia resembles an autocracy under military rule, which also excludes rule by the people or the people having a meaningful role in how they are governed. We now focus our attention on distinguishing due process of law, federalism, and individual rights in the U.S., comparing to authoritarian and totalitarian nations. The first principle, due process of law, we see that the United States focuses on fair laws and defined court systems. These fair laws and defined court systems also include protections of the rights of the accused. This means that a person who has been accused of a crime is entitled to certain protections from the government as to how the government handles the way that they might prosecute or handle that crime. If a person, for example, is accused of committing a crime, they might be arrested. But if they are arrested, they are entitled to have their Miranda rights read to them. The Miranda rights emerged in the 1960s to make certain that people are made aware of their rights as an accused person, such as the right to an attorney and the right not to speak, so that they don't commit self-incrimination. They don't say something that then might be used against them in the upcoming court proceedings. We compare this to North Korea, a totalitarian regime. Here, the government uses arrest and executions to maintain fear and control. This means that the government arrests people and kills people so that other people will be so fearful about breaking the law that they will avoid doing so, especially if they learn that some folks have committed what are considered crimes in that country and they are executed for it, such as speaking against particular leaders or institutions or engaging in certain personal practices. In an authoritarian regime such as Russia, due process is applied to certain individuals, but not for all people. So, for example, a political competitor might be arrested, but that person might be given a trial, that person might be given access to the media to talk about their experience, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that all persons who are accused of crimes are given the same level of due process. But it might be that someone who's attracted the attention of the international community who was accused of committing a certain crime might be granted due process in a way that's very different than those who might not be then in the eye of the international community through the media. Looking at federalism. In the United States, there are three levels of government: the national government, which is called the supreme law of the land in the U.S. Constitution, the state government, or the local government. This means that we have governments that are furthest away from us, such as the United States Congress, and that level of government makes decisions that affect everybody in the country equally. There is a state government which is somewhat closer to the people, makes decisions affecting the entire state, And then there is local government. And then the local government makes decisions that affect everyone within a specific municipality. A municipality is another term for local government that can be termed a city, a town, a village, or a county. In a totalitarian regime, there are modified levels of government, with the national government being supreme. And in Russia, there are levels of government, with the national government also being supreme. So what we see going on here is that federalism gives the opportunity for government to be close to the people. And with the opportunity for government to be close to the people, this means that the people can interact with government, give their opinions about government, and have influence on how the government functions. Well, if there's no local and state governments, if there's only a national government, that's a government that's going to be farthest from the people. And then we focus on individual rights. The U.S. Constitution includes the Bill of Rights. This is the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. In a totalitarian regime, the government restricts all civil liberties, including the freedom of expression. In an authoritarian regime very similar to a totalitarian regime, free speech and media are restricted and other human rights are violated. This means that taking the United States, and we compare the United States to North Korea and Russia, the United States has a very heavy emphasis on individual rights by including the U.S. Bill of Rights in the U.S. Constitution. The Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution in 1791, whereas in North Korea and in Russia, there are restrictions on civil liberties, including the freedom of expression. We now focus our attention on distinguishing limited government and representative government in the U.S. compared to authoritarian and totalitarian nations. The United States has a limited government. This means that the U.S. Constitution outlines government structure and power such that each of the three branches of government is given a specific listing as to the powers that it has. Now, some powers might be more expansive than other powers, but that doesn't mean that those powers aren't limited. Another limitation on that power, as we discussed earlier, is checks and balances, allowing another branch of government to have a say in how a particular branch of government operates. The U.S. also has a representative government, which means that the people represent themselves in a representative democracy. The people elect representatives to make decisions on their behalf. Now, North Korea has a constitution, but it is not a representative democracy. This means that North Korea has a list of powers as to how much power different people in the government have, but the truth is that the people don't have a say in how that government functions or works, even though, as we discussed, there are elections, but those elections are neither free nor fair. In an authoritarian regime such as Russia, there is a 1993 constitution that did create a republican form of government and a system of separation of powers. Also in that same constitution, Russia was declared a democratic state and a republican form of government. But an authoritarian regime conflicts with these principles. So consequently, even though there is a constitution, this constitution doesn't play as meaningful a role in the decisions that the authoritarian leader makes compared with the United States. Next, we focus our attention on the rule of law and separation of powers. In the United States, everyone must obey the law, including government officials. This means that government officials can be held accountable for breaking laws, even though they themselves have power, even if they themselves played a role in writing or enacting certain laws. They can still be held accountable to those laws. There is also a separation of powers in the United States, meaning that there are three branches of government representing the three core powers of government, which is legislative, executive, and judicial. Next, there is no concept of the rule of law in North Korea, which is described by many as a dictatorship. The dictator is the rule of law. The dictator is the law. And consequently, there's no separate standard that applies to everyone because the dictator decides which laws that person wants to follow and which laws that other people have to follow. North Korea does have three branches, the administrative, legislative, and judicial, but they are not independent of one another. What this means is that this concept of checks and balances that is enabled by separation of powers does not exist because there is no independence among the three branches of government in North Korea. And then when we're looking at authoritarianism, because there is no concept of a rule of law, that also means that the three branches of government have very little power, except as much power as the authoritarian regime, in this case the president of Russia, allows the legislature or the Duma to have. Thank you so much for joining me for Middle School Civics Highlights. Do you still have questions? I imagine that you do. If so, please contact us using the information that appears on the screen. Till next time, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine. Thank you for joining me.